Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku could see ghosts? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. "We're with you, kid," the fifth had promised, his voice nothing more than a gravelly echo lost within the misty landscape of One for All. If that were true, Izuku wondered distantly, why did the silence of his bedroom feel so deafening? He lay flat on his back, arms splayed, half expecting the mattress to give way beneath him. Sleep wasn't coming, and the silence of his bedroom pressed against him like a weight. The mattress beneath him had lost its solidity, feeling less like a bed and more like a thin, temporary raft floating atop a vast, unknowable sea. He stayed perfectly still, half expecting the fabric to give way and let him sink into the depths at any moment. Above him, the ceiling served as a gallery for shifting shadows, though they eventually landed on the familiar, frozen grin of All Might. The posters beamed down with a heroic triumph that was meant to inspire hope, but tonight, that unwavering confidence felt like pressure. Those painted eyes were fixed perpetually on a victorious future, while Izuku remained firmly anchored to a present that felt anything but certain. Turning his head, he watched his own hands. His fingers were calloused now, mapped with scars that still ached whenever it rained or the quirk was pushed too far. As he flexed them slowly, feeling the tight pull of healed skin over old damage, he thought of his mother and the crushing weight of what he couldn't say. He could tell her, of course, she had always listened with a fierce love. But he could already see the transformation, her smile faltering, her eyes turning glassy and fearful, and that frantic tremor returning to her hands the moment she realized her son was carrying something heavier than just a physical wound. She wouldn't hear duty or responsibility, she would only hear danger. To add another weight to her heart was a burden Izuku simply couldn't bring himself to impose. His friends offered a different kind of complication. Uraraka would meet the news with earnest concern and a joke to lighten the mood, while Ida would grow rigid, immediately drafting the protocols and rules for a burden Izuku hadn't asked him to share. Then there was Todoroki, whose mismatched eyes would see too much and say too little. They were heroes in the making, yes, but this was a haunting embedded in his very bones. It was a war passed down through generations, a fairy tale gone wrong. Even if they believed him, the distance between them would change. He would stop being Midoriya Izuku, the classmate, and become abnormal. He hated being abnormal. Then there was Aizawa-sensei. Izuku let out a tired, breathless huff of laughter, staring at the ceiling until it blurred into a gray haze. His teacher already lived one inconvenience away from a migraine, and handing him the mystery of the century felt less like asking for help and more like courting disaster. At best, it would earn him another lecture on self-preservation he knew he couldn't follow. At worst, expulsion, probably expulsion. Or at least an attempt at one. Even with All Might and Kaken in the inner circle, a chasm remained. All Might understood the power's purpose, but he hadn't lived with the voices or the memories of others pressing against his thoughts at odd moments. And while Kaken knew the secret, knowing wasn't the same as understanding. Neither of them felt the hum of 6 other souls beneath their skin, nor did they wake with the phantom taste of smoke in their mouths or the residual chill of a hand brushing a shoulder when no one was there. The predecessors were with him, certainly, tucked into the marrow of his bones and woven into his fibers, but as Izuku closed his eyes, the only heartbeat he could actually hear was his own. So, yes, he was alone. After 4 hours of staring at the ceiling, Izuku finally accepted that sleep wasn't coming. His thoughts had wound themselves too tightly, looping endlessly through a labyrinth of worries, hypotheticals, and half-formed fears that felt more tangible in the dark. He decided, his voice a dry rasp in the quiet room. The click of the door handle felt like a thunderclap rather than just a small sound. Izuku flinched, his hand lingering on the metal, half expecting a door to fly open and a sleepy, disgruntled classmate to demand what he was doing. But the silence held, thick and undisturbed. The corridor of the 5th floor was a tunnel of shadows, illuminated only by the faint light of the emergency exit signs. Green. Everything was tinted in a sickly, electronic green. It caught on the edges of the nameplates on each door, turning the familiar kanji into jagged, unrecognizable scratch marks. Izuku walked as he shifted his weight to the ball of his feet to minimize the friction against the carpet. Yet, even with all his training, his own breathing sounded like a gale in his ears. Every inhalation felt shallow, the air tasting of floor wax and the faint, lingering scent of Kaken's nitroglycerin sweat that seemed to permeate the very drywall of the upper floors. As he reached the stairs, the temperature seemed to drop. The stairwell was a concrete throat, cold and echo-prone. Izuku gripped the railing, his palms sliding over the chilled steel. Pivot. He tracked the movement of his own shadow, which stretched and distorted against the cinderblock walls, mimicking the gait of something much larger, something older. You're losing it, Izuku. He found himself counting the steps, a nervous habit that usually calmed him but tonight only served to highlight the repetition of his insomnia. 12, 13, 14. At the landing of the fourth floor, he paused. A faint thumping came from behind one of the doors, someone's white noise machine, perhaps, or a restless sleeper kicking at their sheets. It was a reminder that he was surrounded by friends, yet the thin raft feeling he'd felt in bed persisted. He was walking through a graveyard of the living, a place where dreams were being processed in the dark while he carried the waking nightmare of the predecessor's ghosts in his marrow. Ghosts? Were they ghosts? By the time he reached the second floor, the architectural scale of the common area began to open up. The ceiling vanished into a void of darkness where the mezzanine loomed. The large windows of the common room were slabs of obsidian, reflecting nothing but the tiny, blinking lights of the kitchen appliances. The common room at night was too quiet, a sharp contrast to the day's activities. A discarded hoodie draped over the back of a sofa looked like a slumped figure in the gloom. A forgotten book on the coffee table sat like someone had rearranged it to stand on its spine. Izuku's footsteps transitioned from the soft thud of carpet to the sharp, clinical tap of kitchen tile. The sound was lonely. It was a singular noise in a world meant for many. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. The thought of that harsh, fluorescent glare was too violent for the current state of his mind. Instead, he relied on the moonlight spilling through the high windows, silvering the edges of the marble countertops and the stainless steel kettle. He reached for the faucet, the cold water rushing into the kettle with a hollow, metallic roar that seemed loud enough to wake the entire building. Izuku cringed. Why did everything seem so much louder at night? He stared at the swirling water, his reflection caught in the chrome. He looked distorted in the kettle's eyes, his own wide, and looking far younger than a symbol of peace should ever look. He was no ninth wielder, no successor. He was just a boy in a dark kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, staring down at a kettle like it might explode if he blinked wrong, trying to find a way to stop his hands from shaking. The water inside the kettle rolled and screamed, steam ghosting up toward the ceiling in thin, frantic curls. Izuku barely noticed. His thoughts were too loud, too tangled, spiraling inward until the world narrowed to heat and noise and the tight knot in his chest. He gripped the handle harder, knuckles pale. If the water boils for any longer, it's gonna evaporate. The voice came from his right easy, amused, threaded with a quiet laugh, and Izuku jolted like he'd been caught doing something wrong. His head snapped up, heart stuttering. A boy was leaning casually against the counter by the sink. He looked to be around Izuku's age, maybe a year or two older at most. His posture was so loose, so unbothered, it gave the impression he belonged in the space, like the kitchen had simply grown around him. Light blue hair, airy and soft as a fading sky, curled and waved in every direction, stubborn tufts framing a face split by a wide, lived-in grin. Bright blue eyes crinkled with genuine amusement, and a small white bandage sat squarely across the bridge of his nose, as if it had been there long enough to be forgotten. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't look like a vestige. A vestige wouldn't look this real, not here, not in the warm hum of a dorm kitchen, not with the faint scent of instant noodles and cheap detergent lingering in the air. Vestiges were like shadows or misty images and echoes and weight. This boy cast a presence. He wasn't wrapped up in mist. Izuku froze. Questions flooded his mind all at once, overlapping and colliding. Who's this? He had to be an upperclassman, right? Maybe a second year who wandered into the wrong dorm? So why is he in a first-year kitchen? And why this late at night? Should Izuku say something? Ask him to leave? Say hello? Apologize? Do something? Anything? The boy, meanwhile, didn't seem to notice Izuku staring at him at all. He gazed somewhere over Izuku's shoulder, fingers tapping idly against the counter as if keeping time with the tune he hummed under his breath. A song Izuku didn't recognize. Weird, Izuku thought distantly. Did he have an invisibility quirk? And did he think it was turned on right now? If so, was it like Hagecure's constant or something that depended on focus? Or maybe visualization? Light refraction? Perception-based activation? Could it? Oh, the water. In a sudden, panicked motion, Izuku lifted the kettle with one hand, nearly sloshing boiling water over the edge. He fumbled for his all-might Bronze Age limited edition mug with the other, relief flooding him when the water poured cleanly instead of spilling everywhere. As steam curled up around his face, he glanced back at the boy. Still humming. Still not looking at him. Say hello, Izuku told himself. Just say hello. He swallowed, cleared his throat, and spoke quietly, words tumbling over themselves. But thanks for the reminder. Tino, pour the water. I would have completely forgotten. So, thanks. No response. The boy didn't so much as glance in his direction. Okay, Izuku thought, a flush creeping up his neck. That's a little rude. Or maybe he didn't hear me. So Izuku cleared his throat again, louder this time, shoulders squaring as if that might help. Thank you, sorry, I don't know your name. That did it. The boy's head snapped up so quickly Izuku cringed from the pain it would cause. His grin faltered, replaced by something startled and uncertain. He straightened from the counter, bright eyes darting around the room as if searching for another person, anyone who might explain what was happening. Are you? He began, then stopped, blinking. Are you talking to me? Izuku hesitated, confused by the question. Yeah? Am I not supposed to? The boy huffed with laughter, a short, disbelieving sound, then scrubbed a hand through his already messy hair. You're looking right at me, right? He said, eyes bright with something between hope and disbelief. You can see me? Izuku tilted his head, uncertainty knitting his brows. The question itself was strange. Why wouldn't I be able to? But he didn't interrupt it. Instead, he turned back to the counter, reaching for one of Yaoyorozu's neatly arranged tea bags, carefully plucking one from the box. He hesitated for half a second, a familiar stab of guilt flaring at the thought of wasting it, before deciding she probably wouldn't mind. He started, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Blue hair, Izuku said slowly, as if double-checking his own senses. Blue eyes. Bandage on your nose. He let the tea bag fall into his ceramic mug with a soft plop, the string draping over the rim. Then yeah, he finished, a little more confidently now, I can see. The boy froze only for a heartbeat before his face split into a dazzling, unrestrained smile, the kind that felt too big to contain. Holy shit. You can see me, he blurted, eyes lighting up as if he'd just won the lottery. And hear me. He clapped a hand over his mouth immediately afterward, glancing around the empty kitchen like he expected a teacher to materialize out of thin air. Sorry, he added, lowering his voice. I shouldn't swear in front of a kid. Kid? Izuku blinked. The guy couldn't be more than a few years older than him if that. It's okay, Izuku said quickly, instinctively mirroring the hushed tone. Kaken says much worse. The boy's eyebrows shot up. That's the angry, loud, blonde dude? He asked, pointing vaguely with one finger, as if angry, loud, blonde was a category unto itself. The one and only, Izuku confirmed. The blue-haired boy laughed, bright and unrestrained, shoulders shaking. I knew a loud blonde, he said, grin turning fond and crooked. Though he was a little less a-hole why. The words slipped out casually, without malice, and Izuku couldn't help it. He snorted. The sound surprised him enough that he immediately clapped a hand over his mouth, cheeks heating as guilt followed close behind. He shouldn't be laughing at that. Probably. But the boy just grinned wider, clearly pleased. Once the kettle was set down and the steam had thinned, Izuku wrapped both hands around his mug, blowing gently across the surface of the tea. The warmth seeped into his fingers, steadying him just enough to ask the question that had been hovering in the back of his mind. "So," Izuku said, peeking over the rim of his mug, steam fogging his vision just enough to blur the boy's outline, "why Ryu in our dorm?" The boy shrugged, an easy roll of his shoulders that didn't quite match the weight of the question. "I dunno," he said lightly. "Bored, I guess." He tilted his head, grin softening. "Didn't think anyone would be awake or," he added, almost as an afterthought, "that anyone would be able to see me. You know." Izuku did not know. The explanation was vague. Too vague. It slid around the edges of understanding without ever settling into something solid, and that alone made Izuku's stomach twist. Still, he pushed the feeling down, straightening his posture like he'd been taught. "I'm Midoriya Izuku," he said, setting his mug carefully on the counter. He wiped his palm against his pajama pants out of habit before extending his hand. "By the way." The boy didn't take it right away. Instead, his gaze dropped to Izuku's hand, lingering on the scars that crossed his knuckles and fingers, old fractures, healed wrong, a history written in pale lines. For a moment, his expression flickered with something Izuku couldn't place. Hesitation. Fear. Then, slowly, the boy lifted his own hand. He reached out and passed straight through. A sharp, electric chill tore up Izuku's arm, pins and needles erupting where their hands should have met. The sensation was wrong, too cold, too empty, and Izuku gasped, yanking his arm back as if burned. "What the F?" He looked up, horror flooding his chest, green eyes blown wide. The boy only smiled. It wasn't the dazzling grin from before. It was smaller, sadder. Like he'd known this would happen and had been bracing for it all along. The boy laughed softly as he said, "Name's Shirakumo Oboro," he said. "And I'm well." The word landed fully formed in Izuku's mind before it was ever spoken. "Goes." With a shriek torn straight from his throat, Izuku stumbled backward, heel catching on the edge of the rug. The world tilted, his mug clattered somewhere out of sight, and then he hit the floor hard, breath knocked from his lungs as the kitchen lights seemed to glare down at him. He was on the ground, and there was a ghost in his dorm's common room. Izuku was still on the floor when he heard footsteps on the stairs. He essayed in a breath just as Ida appeared at the bottom, hair slightly mussed, posture rigid even in his sleepwear. His glasses were conspicuously absent, leaving his eyes narrowed as he squinted into the dim kitchen. "Midoriya?" Ida asked, concern threading through his voice. "Are you all right?" I heard a yell. Izuku's heart slammed painfully against his ribs. He looked at Ida, real, solid, normal, and then, against his better judgment, flicked his gaze toward the ghost. Toward Shirakumo. The blue-haired boy hovered near the counter, arms folded loosely, expression curious and far too amused for the situation. Izuku scrambled to his feet, movements stiff and clumsy. "I am fine, Ida," he said quickly, words tripping over themselves. "Sorry, I dropped a spoon. On my foot." He winced for emphasis. "Sorry. I'll be quiet." From behind him, Shirakumo snorted. "Nice save, kid." Izuku shot him a sharp glare that only earned him a grin in return. Turning back to Ida, Izuku forced his mouth into something resembling a smile. "Don't worry," he added, more steadily this time. "I'll be up in a few minutes." "Sorry to wake you." Ida visibly relaxed, shoulders lowering as he let out a small sigh. "I am relieved to hear that," he said. "However, you really should be asleep." He gestured vaguely at Izuku's pajamas. "And you must make sure you are properly bundled. It is freezing down here." "Wonder why," Shirakumo remarked. "Yes." Izuku replied immediately. "I will." "Sorry again." "Good night." Ida nodded once, satisfied, and turned back toward the stairs. Only when his footsteps faded did Izuku allow his shoulders to slump just a little. And then he hissed under his breath, eyes snapping back to the ghost. "You're not helping." Shirakumo's grin only widened. "That's the class rep, right?" Shirakumo said, watching the stairwell like he expected Ida to reappear at any second. He chuckled softly. Man, he's a bit of a stickler, isn't he? Ours was way more laid back. Izuku waved a hand, more to steady himself than to dismiss the comment. His heart was still racing, his nerves buzzing from the fall and everything else. Why are... He stopped, exhaling hard, then tried again. How are you here? And why can I see you? Shirakumo hummed, rocking back on his heels. Beats me, he said easily. You're the first. That did not make Izuku feel better. The first? Izuku repeated, voice pitching just slightly higher. Shirakumo tilted his head, studying him with open curiosity, as if Izuku were the strange one here. Yeah, he said. Most people walk right through me. Or don't look my way at all. He smiled, light and crooked. You though? You looked straight at me. Izuku swallowed, fingers curling into the fabric of his sleeves. He had to get upstairs without drawing attention to the fact that a ghost was trailing him like an overenthusiastic stray. He lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, rinsing out his mug twice, wiping down a counter that was already spotless, all the while listening to the silence. The dorm had settled again, the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, heavy and expectant. So, Shirakumo said eventually, drifting a little closer, hands shoved casually into his pockets, you heading to bed or? Izuku flinched. Yeah. I should. Late. Cool, Shirakumo said, voice easy. I'll come with. Izuku froze. No, he said a little too fast. No, you can't. Shirakumo blinked, curiosity flickering across his face. Why not? Because that's the dorms, Izuku hissed, glancing nervously toward the stairwell as if Ida might appear at any second. And Ida's already suspicious, and if he sees me talking to myself in the hallway at God knows what time in the morning. You won't be, Shirakumo said, already drifting toward the stairs. You'll just be walking. That's worse. But Shirakumo didn't stop. He was already halfway up before realizing Izuku hadn't followed. Oh, he said, surprised. Thought I'd what? Stay downstairs? I was hoping, Izuku admitted weakly, shoulders tensing. Shirakumo tilted his head, then shrugged, a cheeky grin spreading across his face. Guess your wish won't come true. And just like that he continued upward. Izuku followed, heart in his throat, every step tight and careful. He half expected something resistance, a barrier, anything but nothing happened. Shirakumo moved through the stairwell as if it were as ordinary as air, and the ease only made it worse. The hallway lights flicked on automatically as Izuku passed, the motion sensors buzzing softly in response. Shirakumo didn't trigger them. That was notable. Izuku filed it away mentally, fingers tightening into fists at his sides as his brain frantically searched for patterns, for rules, for anything that could make sense of this. Inside his room, Izuku shut the door quietly and leaned back against it, breathing out through his nose. Shirakumo hovered near the center of the room, hands still tucked casually into his pockets, eyes bright with interest. Oh, you guys get super nice dorms. Too bad we didn't get any. We. Izuku echoed faintly, tension creeping back into his voice. Shirakumo waved a hand, dismissive. Later. Izuku sank onto his bed, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the edge of the mattress. He stared at the floor for a long moment, letting the quiet press against him before finally looking up. Okay, he said, voice trembling despite himself. We need to talk about this. Yeah, Shirakumo said readily, voice casual. Figured. Izuku swallowed hard. The ghost. Last time I checked, yes, Shirakumo said. His tone wasn't upset, more curious, almost amused. And I can see you, Izuku continued, voice rising slightly. And hear you. And you can move around. And you pass through my hand. Not my best first impression, Shirakumo admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. So, is your quirk like the ability to see ghosts? Izuku shook his head, squeezing his eyes shut. No, well, wait, hold on. He exhaled sharply, willing the fifth, the universe, something, to explain. Why could he see him? He pressed his palms into the mattress, staring at Shirakumo as if the boy's casual hovering could somehow be erased by sheer will. Oh, you'll listen, he said, voice shaking a little. You can't just float around my room whenever you feel like it. You have to, I don't know, follow some rules. Shirakumo tilted his head, chin resting on one hand. Rules, huh? Like bedtime rules? Yes. Izuku snapped, then immediately quieted himself, cheeks heating. Exactly. Like don't wander into the hall at night, don't touch things, he hesitated, biting his lip. Actually, can you touch things? Well, if you can, just not in a way that alarms everyone. Shirakumo laughed, soft and unbothered, letting his weight shift from one foot to the other. Relax, kid. I can't exactly break anything like this. Izuku swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but his brain was short-circuiting. Instead, he sank lower onto the mattress, gripping the edge like it could anchor him. So, you're a ghost, he whispered. But, you have, I dunno, do you have a quirk that acts as an energy stockpiler? Or something that is released after death? Shirakumo shrugged again, smiling faintly. Afraid not. But maybe this works something like that. I don't really know the mechanics, either. I just exist. Guess you're the lucky one who can see me. Izuku's head spun. Lucky? He didn't feel lucky. He felt exhausted. And terrified. Can you leave? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Shirakumo floated closer, tilting his head. Sure. I can leave. But, why would I? Izuku groaned, burying his face in his hands. Why indeed? They stayed like that for a long minute, the hum of the dorm quiet around them, the faint buzz of the hallway lights outside the door, and Izuku realized he wasn't sure whether he wanted to sleep or just keep watching this impossible thing hover in front of him. Finally, he forced himself upright. Fine. One night. But, tomorrow we need to figure out what this actually means. Why you exist. Why I can see you. All of it. Maybe it has something to do with One for All? Shirakumo's grin widened, sharp and mischievous. Tomorrow, huh? Does that technically mean today? If so, looking forward to it. You seem pretty smart, so I'm not worried. Shoyuda thinks so too, you know. Shoyuda? You mean Aizawa? Izuku asked, and Shirakumo nodded. Yep. Izuku groaned again and flopped back onto the mattress, eyes shutting. The edges of fear and curiosity tangled together in a tight knot, just waiting for morning. Izuku sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes, trying to ignore the lingering tension from the night before. He was just about to swing his legs over the side when a familiar, airy voice floated through the room. Morning, sleepyhead. Izuku froze. Shirakumo hovered near the window, hair catching the light, hands tucked casually into his pockets. His grin was already in place, impossibly bright and calm, like floating around a first-year dorm room at sunrise was the most normal thing in the world. Shirakumo. Why are you here? Izuku hissed, jumping out of bed. Shirakumo tilted his head. Where else would I be? You said we needed to figure things out, right? I'm being punctual. Izuku's heart hammered. Punctual? You're a ghost. He ran a hand through his messy hair, trying to focus. You can't follow me around during the day. People will see. Shirakumo waved him off. Relax. No one can see me but you. Like I said, you're the lucky one. Lucky? Izuku repeated as his stomach tightened. He swallowed and tried to steady himself. Okay, fine. Just don't, distract me or hover too close in class. Got it. Shirakumo floated a little closer, smirking. Too late. You're already distracted. Besides, I'm curious. I want to see what a day in your life looks like. I usually hang around Sho or Zashi, but now I've got someone else to bother, and I can actually bother you by doing something other than passing through people. Izuku groaned and pulled on his uniform hastily. This is going to be the longest day ever. The green-haired boy did his best to avoid conversation with his classmates, afraid that Shirakumo would make him laugh, or rile him up that he hisses at the boy to stop. That would be too embarrassing. By the time he reached the classroom, Shirakumo had drifted just behind him, leaning over chairs, peeking at his notes, humming softly under his breath. Izuku tried to ignore him, lowering himself into his desk, but every now and then, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, a flick of blue hair, a flash of those bright eyes. Kachib and Todoroki were already there, and Izuku was painfully aware of how normal everyone looked. No one else noticed the ghost drifting around him, commenting quietly, pointing out little details only he could see. Nice handwriting. You've been practicing, huh? Do you really think we need that many pencils? Class rep strict today. Should be fun. Izuku clenched his fists under the desk. Fun? Fun? This isn't fun. He tried to focus on Aizawa's voice, on the whiteboard, on anything that would block out the impossible presence floating behind him. Shirakumo, of course, didn't sit still. By the end of the PRD, he was perched on the edge of Izuku's desk, one leg dangling casually, like he'd always belonged there. You look tired, Midoriya, Shirakumo said, frowning slightly. Then, his grin softened into something conspiratorial. Hey, you can take a nap and I can just tell you what you missed. It's just homeroom, so no worries, I used to do it all the time. No, Izuku muttered, rubbing his eyes as he groaned and lowered his face into his arms. Shirakumo shrugged and began pacing around the classroom, his presence like a whisper in a room full of people who couldn't notice him. He leaned slightly over Aizawa, poking at his hair and making exaggerated gestures, trying to provoke a reaction, all to make Izuku laugh. And a part of Izuku, the part that had been staring at the ghost all night, couldn't help but watch, curious despite himself. Shirakumo, grinning that impossible grin, seemed to know it. Izuku let out a soft snort of laughter before he realized it. Something funny, Midoriya? A voice asked sharply. Izuku jerked upright, ears flushing bright red. Sorry. Shirakumo cringed, throwing his hands up in mock apology. My bad. Izuku's face heated further. No, sir. Sorry. I. His words tumbled over themselves as he lowered his head again, muttering under his breath. Why does this keep happening? Shirakumo simply leaned back on the desk, one hand dangling lazily, watching Izuku with an expression that was part amusement, part curiosity. Relax, kid. You're fine. No one saw anything except me, but well, me. Izuku groaned into his arms, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He didn't even know what me was yet. A ghost? A leftover quirk? And somehow, he was supposed to act normal while this impossible thing floated around his classroom? The bell rang, slicing through the tension, and Izuku blinked, realizing he hadn't been taking notes at all. Shirakumo grinned wider, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Guess we'll figure out the real fun after class. Izuku hurried out of the classroom, hoping that if he moved fast enough, Aizawa wouldn't force him to stay behind. I really am sorry, Midoriya, Shirakumo said, frowning slightly. I just got super excited. Izuku shook his head, exhaling through his nose to calm himself. No, it's all right. I would have acted the same way if I were you. He meant it. Despite everything, he genuinely appreciated Oboro's curiosity and energy. After school, he added, determination creeping into his voice, we'll head to the library. We can look for any info, anything that might explain what's going on. Oboro's grin returned, bright and mischievous. Sounds like a plan. Izuku hesitated for a moment, then said, You can call me Izuku. No use in using last names, right? Oboro tilted his head, considering for a second, then nodded. All right, Izuku. Then call me Oboro. Okay, Oboro, Izuku said, letting the name settle. For the first time since this strange encounter began, he felt a small flicker of control, like maybe, just maybe, he could figure this out. Oboro floated a little closer, leaning on the doorway as the other students filed past. So, Izuku, be honest with me now. What do you think of the present mixed banana butt looking hair? With a laugh and as they walked down the hall together, Izuku couldn't help but notice just for a moment how normal it almost felt. Almost. Getting through just one day without anyone realizing Izuku felt like he was well, going insane was proving to be an impossible feat. Every glance from a teacher, every passing student in the crowded UA hallways, made his chest tighten and his fingers flex instinctively. Each unbalanced step felt like walking a tightrope over a pit he couldn't see. One misstep, one stray word caught by the wrong ears, and the fragile reality he was clinging to would shatter. Shirakumo Oboro, on the other hand, was obnoxiously fun to talk to. The blue-haired boy possessed an effortless charm, like a cool older cousin who only appeared once a year at family gatherings, though Izuku had no such cousins to compare him to. The warmth and playful teasing in Oboro's manner made him an easy anchor, a small island of normalcy in a day that was anything but. Even when Oboro disappeared briefly, only to reappear a second later hovering horizontally above Izuku's desk, his pulse skipped, not from fear, well, maybe a little bit, but mostly from sheer fascination. Izuku tried to focus on present mix English lecture. He really tried. He scribbled notes mechanically, his pen flying across the page, but it was impossible to ignore the boy in the corner of his vision. Oboro was a constant, shimmering outline drifting casually behind him, his goggles pushed up onto his forehead and a wide, easy grin ever present. Driven by a sudden, frantic need for data, Izuku shifted slightly in his seat. He slid his hand toward the empty air where Oboro's arm rested, testing his theory of tangibility. "Hey," he whispered under his breath. His fingers passed straight through the blue-haired boy. A jolt of sharp pins and needles, cold as ice and buzzing like static, shot up his arm. Izuku let out a soft yelp of surprise. A few desks away, Todoroki shot him a sharp, questioning look. Izuku immediately buried his face in his textbook, his ears burning a bright, humiliated red. Oboro chuckled, the sound vibrating in the air like a distant radio frequency. He floated closer, leaning lazily over the green-haired teen's desk until their noses were inches apart. "Careful, kid. You're gonna hurt yourself if you start panicking every time I will move." "I'm not panicking," Izuku hissed as softly as he could, curling his fingers into fists to hide the lingering tremors. "I'm just, testing the physics of how you exist." Oboro's grin widened. "I exist just fine. You're the one overthinking it. You've got that look in your eye like you're trying to solve a math equation that doesn't have any numbers." "I don't think I'm thinking enough," Deku muttered, glancing back at his notebook. "Or maybe I am thinking too much." The questions began to spiral in his mind, organized into neat, panicked rows. One for all, the vestiges they were essentially echoes or ghosts, right? But they existed within a mental plane, a throne room inside his subconscious. They didn't manifest in the physical world, floating over his shoulder during English class. What's the difference? He wondered. Is it because the wielders function within the quirk's DNA? But Oboro isn't part of the succession. Could the recent manifestation of Black Whip have cracked the door open to other spirits? Was seeing ghosts a hidden quirk of a past user, like the fifth or sixth? How does the vestige world even interface with the physical one? Izuku groaned into his sleeves, frustrated by the mountain of questions and the total lack of a syllabus to answer them. By lunchtime, Izuku's anxiety had been partially replaced by a daring streak of scientific curiosity. He stayed behind in the classroom for a few minutes while Ida, Todoroki, and Uraraka headed to the cafeteria, assuring them he'd join them shortly. Once the room was relatively empty, he nudged a pencil toward the edge of his desk, watching Oboro intently. "Can you move things? Even a little?" Oboro hummed, looking at the yellow pencil. He concentrated, his brow furrowing slightly, and flicked it with a fingertip. The pencil rolled exactly 3 inches across the wood. It was a tiny movement, but to Izuku, it felt like an earthquake. "Okay, so you can interact with the physical plane?" Izuku asked, his voice a breathless whisper. Oboro shrugged lazily, hovering a little higher until his hair brushed the ceiling tiles. "A little, but not like full-on grabbing stuff. It took me 3 years just to learn how to flick a light switch without falling through the floor. Even if I could do more, it'd be risky, right? People tend to notice when objects start flying around on their own." He tilted his head, a faint, mischievous glint in his eye. "Speaking of risky," Izuku's stomach tightened. The combination of Oboro's presence thrilling, impossible, and completely unnerving made his brain fire off hypotheses and fears in equal measure. Oboro drifted a fraction closer, his form brushing past Izuku's notebook. He didn't touch the paper, but the sheer proximity sent a tiny, static shiver down the page, making the paper flutter. Izuku yelped, nearly fumbling his notebook onto the floor, catching it just in time against his chest. "You scared me again," he whispered, his face flushed. Oboro laughed, floating backward with his hands behind his head. "Scaredy cat," he teased. "You're really intense, you know that? You remind me of another kid I knew." Deku swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk. The mention of someone Oboro had left behind made the reality of the situation sink in even deeper. Is he gone too?" His voice was barely audible, but Oboro's eyes softened. The playful light didn't disappear, but it settled into something more nostalgic, perhaps a little bit lonely. "Nah, he's around still," Oboro said. He looked toward the classroom door, his gaze lingering on the empty hallway. "Just don't faint every time I move, Midoriya. It's exhausting watching you try to hide me from your friends." Deku let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It escaped as a small, shaky laugh. Somehow, despite the impossible logic of it all, the fear was beginning to ebb. In its place was a burgeoning sense of wonder. If Oboro was here, maybe there was a reason. Maybe Izuku wasn't just losing his mind, maybe he was just finding a new way to see the world. "I'll try," Izuku promised, packing his bag. "But no promises if you start walking through walls while I'm talking to someone." Oboro winked. "No promises, kid." The bell rang, its shrill resonance signaling the end of the PRD, and the hallways immediately flooded with the chaotic energy of the UA student body. "Ah, man, you didn't get to eat." Izuku shrugged lightly. "It's okay, I'll stop by after school, lunch rush usually hangs back for an hour." The air in the corridor shifted, smelling faintly of lemon-scented cleaning spray and the savory, heavy aroma of food wafting up from the cafeteria behind him. Lockers slammed with rhythmic thuds in the distance, and the high-pitched squeak of sneakers on polished linoleum made Izuku's heart jump. Every sound felt magnified, every movement a potential threat to his secret. Izuku froze mid-step as Oboro suddenly drifted right through him. The sensation was like a wave of static electricity, a cold, numbing buzz that traveled from his chest to his toes. Oboro reappeared a few feet away with a soft, visual pop, looking completely unbothered. Izuku stumbled backward, his heel catching on the strap of a stray backpack. He let out a startled, high-pitched squeak that drew a few curious looks from passing second years. "Whoa, sorry," Oboro teased, hovering just out of reach, his legs kicked out as if he were reclining on an invisible sofa. "I didn't expect you to jump like that." "You definitely did," Izuku hissed, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. "I definitely did." "Whoops," Oboro admitted, his grin widening until it crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Careful." "Quiet," Izuku chanted internally. He pressed his palms against the cool metal of the lockers for support, his breath hitching as he caught sight of a familiar slumped silhouette. Aizawa-sensei was walking down the hall, his yellow sleeping bag tucked under one arm, his gaze fixed on the floor. Izuku's heart thumped painfully against his ribs. He watched Aizawa's heavy, rhythmic footsteps, the sound echoing like a drumbeat in his ears. Beside him, Oboro froze. For the first time, the ghost's playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a rare flicker of intense, quiet seriousness. He hovered like a statue, his eyes locked on the tired man walking toward them. Please don't let him see. Please don't let him sense anything," Izuku prayed, holding his breath until his lungs burned. Aizawa passed them without a glance, his expression as neutral and exhausted as ever. Once the teacher vanished around the corner, both of them living and dead exhaled in unison. Oboro smirked faintly, though there was a lingering shadow in his eyes as he leaned casually against the air where the lockers met the wall. "See? No one saw anything," Oboro said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "But we really should be careful." "Says the one who is anything but," Izuku muttered, shaking his head and adjusting his yellow backpack straps. By the time the final bell echoed and the last few students trickled out toward the dorms, Izuku's shoulders slumped in profound relief. The tension of keeping up appearances had left him drained, but his mind was still racing. He and Oboro made their way to the library, weaving through the towering stacks until they found a quiet corner tucked away in the back, far from the reach of the evening study groups. Golden afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the beams. Izuku opened his notebook to a fresh page, his pen hovering over the paper. He began scribbling. Observations. Hypothesis. Triggers. So, what we know so far, Izuku said finally, his voice barely a whisper. You can float, pass through solid matter, and interact with objects, though it takes a lot of effort. But no one else can see you. Exactly, Oboro said with a nod, drifting over a mahogany table. And there are limits, sure, but you're smart enough to figure some of them out yourself. He paused, his eyes flicking toward the window, watching the clouds drift by. When he looked back at Izuku, his expression was softer, more grounded. There's some things I haven't finished. Some things I'm still holding on to. I think that's part of why I'm still here. Izuku frowned, his analytical mind whirring. Unfinished? What do you mean? Like a tether? Oboro's expression darkened, a look of profound frustration crossing his face, as if he were trying to comb through distant, foggy memories that refused to take shape. I wish I knew, he admitted quietly. Everything from back then. It's like looking at a photo that's been left out in the rain and stomped over. A lot. Izuku tapped his pen against the notebook. Despite the chaos of the day, he realized something surprising. He wasn't terrified anymore. Oboro was an impossibility, a defiance of every law of nature he understood, but he was also kind. So, what do you remember? How long have you been? Izuku trailed off, trying to find a delicate way to phrase the question. Dead. Oboro finished for him. His tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, but the weight of the word made Izuku's stomach twist. The notebook felt heavy in Izuku's hands. He hesitated, then scrawled the word down anyway. Status, deceased. Oboro scratched the back of his head sheepishly. I think, maybe around 13 years? Give or take a few semesters. 13 years. Izuku's eyes nearly popped out of his head. You're practically a grandpa. Oboro threw back his head and laughed, a bright, melodic sound that seemed to make the very air vibrate. A grandpa? Seriously? Look at me, Midoriya. I'm 17. Izuku blinked, his cheeks burning. Right? 17, and dead for 13 years. So, you stay the age you were when you passed. I guess so, Oboro agreed, floating a little closer, his blue hair catching the amber glow of the sunset. So you'd actually be, what, 30? That's old enough to be a dad, Izuku countered, his brain reflexively doing the math. Yeah, if I had a kid as a kid, Oboro said with a faint, wistful shrug. That's only if the kid was my age, Izuku pointed out, raising an eyebrow. You could have had a baby. You'd be a full-grown adult right now. Oboro's smile dipped into a small, reflective frown. Oh, yeah. I guess I would be. The silence that followed was heavy. Izuku bit his lip, realizing he'd poked at a wound that couldn't heal. I'm sorry. That definitely Esikis. To just stop, while everyone else keeps going. Oboro waved a hand dismissively, his megawatt grin returning in full force. I don't sweat it, kid. Can't change the past, right? Besides, I've got you now to hang with. He leaned back into a mid-air sprawl. Makes school a lot more interesting, doesn't it? Better than staring at walls for a decade. Izuku groaned, burying his face in his hands as the sheer insanity of his life hit him all over again. Interesting? I'm talking to a ghost in the UA library. This is completely insane. Izuku, Oboro said, his voice dropping to a more serious register as he floated closer. We live in a world where a guy down the street might have hairdryers for hands or a giant cactus for a head. You really think a little spectral haunting is where things finally get crazy? Izuku huffed out a shaky laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. No, when you put it like that, maybe it's not that crazy. His smile faded, his fingers curling into the fabric of his UA blazer. But I just really want to figure out why. Why me? He looked up at Oboro, his green eyes sharp and searching. You've been around for 13 years. I've existed this whole time too. Why did you only show up today? What changed? Oboro didn't joke this time. He hovered in place, his gaze becoming unfocused, staring at something far beyond the library walls. If I had the answer to that, he said finally, I'd probably be a lot less confused about a lot of things. Izuku nodded slowly, already turning the question over in his mind. Quirks didn't just manifest new properties without a catalyst. There had to be a trigger. A specific condition met. Something in the world or within Izuku himself had shifted. Which meant it could stop just as suddenly, right? That was the thought that haunted the back of Izuku's mind. If this was a glitch in the universe, glitches eventually got fixed, reprogrammed out of existence. Oboro leaned back slightly, arms crossing in midair as he transitioned from a sprawl to a vertical hover just above the floor tiles. So, I've been doing all the talking. What's your quirk, anyway? You've got those scars on your hands and you look like you're ready to bolt at any second. Super strength or something? He asked, raising a thick blue brow. Izuku frowned, the weight of the secret pressing against his tongue. He could tell Oboro about One for All, couldn't he? Who would a ghost tell? But the ingrained habit of secrecy, the voice of All Might reminding him of the danger, held him back. This wasn't a conversation for a drafty library corner, that was a conversation for the heavy silence of his dorm room. It's a little hard to explain, Izuku replied, choosing his words with surgical precision. I'm an energy stockpiler. I take in energy my own, or sometimes the residual energy from other quirks, he whispered, his voice dropping to a low murmur as he thought of the vestiges. And I convert it into physical power. Speed, strength, durability. Oboro tilted his head, his playful expression sharpening into something keenly observant. Oh, so can't you do the same thing mentally? Or perceptually? Huh. Izuku looked up, the pen pausing its frantic dance across the page. Mentally? I don't think so. I mean, I have to consciously activate it. It's a physical switch. Oboro floated a little closer, eyes glinting, but there was nothing to cause the reflection of light. The physical part of it is just the output, though. If your quirk acts as a stockpiler, it's not like a light switch that's either on or off. The reservoir is always there. It's residual. So, maybe there's a connection. You convert energy into action. Well, I am energy, but there's no body left to convert me back into something physical. Maybe that's why you can see me. Your quirk is tuning in to the frequency I'm broadcasting on. But, he hummed, that doesn't explain why you can see me now and not a month ago. Izuku's mind began to spin, gears grinding as he tried to bridge the gap between biology and the paranormal. Residual energy, that would mean that after a body dies, the energy doesn't just dissipate into the atmosphere, right? Oboro nodded, warming up to the theory. Exactly. It means quirks don't necessarily decompose with their users' bodies. Not immediately, anyway. Izuku's eyes widened, his inner fanboy theorist taking the wheel. Like quirk factors. We know the quirk factor is a biological mechanism, but what if there's a metaphysical component? Maybe when the body breaks down, the quirk factor's energy is released like a pressurized gas from a canister. Oboro's grin faltered slightly. Maybe, though I always thought quirks were just extensions of the body. Like an extra limb. When the body goes, the limb goes. That's the logic, right? But what's the difference between energy and extensions? Izuku asked, his brow furrowing as he leaned over his notebook. Think about heteromorphs versus emitter types. A tail is an extension, sure, but the fire a person breathes is energy. My quirk stores energy and uses it to bolster my cells. It's an extension of me, but it's still fundamentally power. So why would yours linger while others vanish? Oboro descended until his feet were just an inch from the floor, his fingers intertwined. I don't know if I can explain it properly. But, okay, think of it this way. When a person dies, the body starts decomposing, but that quirk factor, that spark, doesn't always just wink out. It's not tied to the physical heart or brain anymore. It can exist on its own, drifting. Until, he paused, his eyes turning distant and hazy. Until that energy has nowhere to go. Like me. My quirk. It was still full of potential when I died. It couldn't pass on. It couldn't be absorbed. Izuku scribbled furiously. Hypothesis: ghostly manifestation residual quirk factor plus high energy potential physical vessel. So, that leftover energy, since it has nothing physically tying it down, it takes the shape of the last thing it knew? You. Oboro smiled faintly, a touch of melancholy beneath the bravado. I think so. Residual quirk energy finally forming into, well, me. Okay, so your energy shaped by a leftover quirk factor, Izuku summarized, his mind racing to the next logical step. If I can see you, it's because my quirk interacts with energy on that level. It recognizes you. Does that mean other people with energy-based abilities could see you? Oboro shrugged, the sadness flickering away as his grin returned. Could be. I wouldn't have guessed it would, though. You're the first one to even blink in my direction. But wouldn't that mean I should be seeing other ghosts too? The words still felt alien, a supernatural trope invading a world of, well, the supernatural. Maybe you have? Oboro suggested. When I see other ghosts, they don't all look like me. Some look like they're still alive, they aren't all floaty or glowing. You might have walked right past a dozen of them today and just thought they were students from another department. Izuku paused, his pen hovering precariously. Wait, you don't have to hover? Nope. Oboro replied, popping the P, as he planted his feet firmly on the library carpet. I just do it because it beats walking. Plus, it's fun. You didn't even realize I was dead until I passed through you. So maybe to see a ghost for the first time, you need an external trigger. A collision of energies. Izuku tapped his pen nervously. So, if quirk factors normally die with the body, yours didn't. But when a body finally decays or when another quirk factor overlaps, he swallowed hard, thinking of his own power. Then the energy has to react. It takes form. It creates a ghost. Oboro nodded. Exactly. It's messy, unpredictable, and yeah, a little absurd. But it fits the science of quirks, in a way. It's kind of poetic, isn't it? Energy refusing to be wasted. Izuku let out a long, shaky breath. Energy can't die. It just changes form. Laws of thermodynamics. But what happened to your body, then? If you're still here, where is the rest of you? Oboro's smile turned small and serious. I've tried to figure that out too. But there are gaps. Big ones. Things I don't remember, places I can't go. You seeing me, maybe it's just a fluke. A cosmic accident. A fluke? Izuku whispered, the thought of this being an accident making his stomach twist. If it was an accident, it could be corrected. Oboro could vanish as quickly as he appeared. Oboro chuckled, the sound echoing softly against the mahogany bookshelves. Maybe. Or maybe the universe just has a weird sense of humor. Izuku couldn't help but laugh quietly, the heavy tension in his chest easing just a fraction. A weird sense of humor, yeah, that sounds about right for my life. He gripped his notebook tighter, watching the sunset cast long, skeletal shadows across the library floor. Okay, Izuku whispered, let's test just a few more things. Oboro hovered a few feet ahead, his playful grin back in place. Test away, Professor. I trust your careful, scientific hands won't accidentally vaporize me, right? Izuku rolled his eyes. I'll try my best. He extended a hand cautiously, reaching for Oboro's shoulder. As if on cue, Oboro drifted forward, sliding straight through Izuku's palm. That familiar jolt of pins and needles like hitting your funny bone with an ice cube shot up Izuku's arm. He yelped, his legs kicking up in a reflex, nearly knocking his backpack off the chair. His pen slipped from his grip and clattered across the floor. Oboro hovered over the fallen pen, miming the action of polishing it with his ghostly fingers. You dropped this, Professor, he said, smirking. Ha, very funny, Izuku hissed, pressing his palms to the table to steady himself. I'm just gathering data. Oboro shook his head, laughing. Sure. That's what they all say. Who's all? Izuku asked, brow furrowed. I dunno, Oboro replied with a wink. I heard it on the TV in the teacher's lounge. They have great snacks in there, by the way. Too bad I can't eat 'em. Izuku scribbled frantic notes as Oboro hovered in place, then tried something bolder. He nudged a pencil across the floor toward Oboro, holding his breath as he watched the yellow wood roll to a stop. Without touching it fully, more like a focused condensation of air, Oboro flicked it with a ghostly fingertip. The pencil rolled a few more inches, clicking softly against the metal leg of a nearby table. Okay, Izuku muttered under his breath, wide-eyed as he recorded the exact distance of the displacement. So you can interact, just a little. But we figured that out at lunch. It's a matter of kinetic transfer without a solid mass. A little, Oboro said, tilting his head and watching his own hand as if he were still getting used to the sight of it. Like I said, anything more and I'd risk, well, who knows what. I can't exactly come back from nothing if I dissipate trying to lift a car. Their experiment continued in small, quiet bursts as the library grew stiller. Oboro demonstrated his range, passing through the dense oak bookshelves, briefly vanishing into a wall and reappearing behind a stack of encyclopedias, and teasing Izuku about how high he flinched every time a cold breeze accompanied his movement. Each time a stray student or a librarian passed by their alcove, Oboro froze midair, silent and still as a statue, blending into the background like a trick of the light. Izuku would instinctively hunch over his notebook, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. When the coast was finally clear, Oboro would smirk, leaning toward him with an easy grace. See? Not so scary if you stay calm. You're getting better at the "I'm totally normal" face. I think I just threw up in my mouth, Izuku whispered, rubbing his chest to soothe the lingering adrenaline. Gross, dude. Oboro's grin softened, becoming something more genuine. You know, you're taking this better than most would. I expected more screaming. Or an exorcist. Really? No idea, Oboro admitted, shrugging. You're the first one I've actually talked to. By the time the clock reached 4 p.m., Izuku's notebook was nearly full of frantic observations, anatomical sketches of Oboro's hero gear, and a list of unanswered questions that seemed to grow with every answer they found. They slipped further into a quiet corner where the late afternoon sunlight streamed across the polished floor, illuminating Oboro's faint, blue-tinted outline and making the dust motes around him look like tiny stars. All right, Izuku said, flipping back to the start of the day's entries. Let's try to make sense of this. He tapped the page, which was covered in diagrams of hand-to-air collisions and notes about quark resonance. If your energy lingers after death, and my quirk can interact with residual energy, then, he paused, chewing on the end of his pen, a habit that made Oboro chuckle. Then maybe I'm only able to see you because of the way my quirk resonates with yours. Like a frequency match. One for All is a stockpiling quirk. It's designed to hold energy. Maybe it's acting like a receiver for your broadcast. Oboro leaned closer, hovering just inches above the floor. Resonance, huh? Fancy. Makes it sound all scientific and intentional. I like it. Izuku's eyes widened, his mind racing through everything he'd ever read about quark factor theory. It is scientific. Energy can't just vanish. Law of conservation of energy. It has to go somewhere. And if your body stopped but your quirk factor couldn't pass on or extinguish, the energy had to stabilize somehow. And that stabilization is you. A self-sustaining loop of quirk energy. You're solid enough to interact with my senses, or at least, the parts of my brain my quirk has unlocked. Oboro nodded, his expression turning unusually serious for a moment. Solid enough? I like that. Makes me sound important. Like I'm still taking up space. Important, Izuku echoed, his voice softening. But also, fragile. If I understand correctly, you only exist in this form because the energy didn't have anywhere else to go. So anything that interferes with that energy, another quirk factor, a massive power surge, or even certain environmental shifts could unmake the pattern? It could unmake you. Oboro's grin faded into a thoughtful frown, his eyes drifting to the window. Could. I've noticed strange things before, spots I can't hover in, certain itchy feelings around other people's quirks. I always just chalked it up to being ghostly limits. Guess you just gave me a better theory to worry about. Izuku leaned back, staring at the ceiling, his brain buzzing. So, you're not just a ghost in the traditional sense. You're like a complex energy pattern. Lingering energy shaped by, what? By your quirk, sure, but also the memories and the personality tied to that quirk factor. You're a manifestation of who you were, projected through the lens of your power. I think it's physical? Oboro murmured, his brow furrowing as if a headache were forming. I remember. I didn't never mind. The memory gets fuzzy when I try to look at the life of it too hard. Izuku decided not to probe the ghost for more information on his final moments. The air always seemed to turn colder when they touched on that subject. Instead, he scribbled rapidly, thoughts racing toward the future. And the thing is, if I can study this carefully, if I can measure how my quirk interacts with yours, maybe we can figure out the rules. We could understand how residual quirk energy interacts with the living. It's a completely new field of study. It's worth a shot, right? Oboro floated closer, his grin returning with a sudden burst of light, his eyes glinting with a familiar mischief. That could be fun. Just imagine the pranks we could pull if we figure out how to make me more solid. Too bad Halloween's passed. I could have really leaned into the aesthetic. Izuku laughed, but the sound was short-lived as reality settled back in. He closed his notebook with a firm thud. We have to be careful, Oboro. We can't let anyone see me talking to thin air, or it could go badly. Tezao-sensei, the other students, they'd think I'm well, they'd think I've finally cracked under the pressure. Oboro waved a hand dismissively, drifting a little higher until he was looking down at Izuku with a wink. Then we'll keep it between us. A little secret experiment. You and me. It makes life and death a whole lot more interesting, doesn't it? Izuku's lips twitched in a reluctant, tired, but hopeful smile. He looked at the empty space where his classmates would see nothing, and where he saw a boy who should have been 30, yet remained 17. Interesting, yeah, I guess that's one word for it. He paused, pen hovering again over the notebook, and added softly, but, if your energy is this stable, this persistent, is there a reason? People always say ghosts have unfinished business, right? Oboro's expression softened, shadowed by something unspoken and ancient. He hovered silently for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the dust motes dancing in the library's dying light. He let out a small, almost wistful sigh, a sound that didn't move the air but seemed to vibrate directly in Izuku's ears. Maybe. I can't really remember clearly. By all rights, I should have been able to pass on, right? So there must be something left for me to do. I feel like I'm missing a piece of the puzzle. Like I left something behind that's still calling out. Izuku's curiosity spiked, pushing past the chilling nature of the conversation. Something left behind? Like a person? Or a promise? Can you tell me what it is? Oboro's grin returned, though it was small and enigmatic, lacking its usual punch. Not yet. Part of the fun is figuring it out. That's why I'm still here after all. And now, part of it might just be figuring you out too, Midoriya. Izuku's stomach twisted with a mixture of awe and nervous anticipation. The golden hour sunlight caught on Oboro's faint outline, making him look almost tangible for a fleeting second, almost real but still heartbreakingly unreal. The notebook in his hands felt heavier now, weighted down by the magnitude of the questions it held. These weren't just academic notes anymore. They were a ledger of a life suspended. Izuku exhaled, his fingers tightening around the pen until his knuckles turned white. So what now? Oboro hummed, spinning slowly in midair like he was considering the question from every angle at once. The sunlight passed through him in soft, refracted bands, breaking his outline into something watercolor thin and ethereal. Now, he echoed. Now you do what you always do, don't you? Izuku blinked, taken aback. I do. Yeah, I've gotten to learn a bit about you and your classmates just from hanging around Sho, Oboro said, his grin widening as he mentioned the familiar nickname for Aizawa. You overthink. You hypothesize. You poke the thing until the thing pokes back. Izuku huffed out a quiet laugh despite the gravity of the situation. That's not okay, maybe that is accurate. I have a habit of investigating. He glanced back down at his notes, eyes skimming half-finished equations and arrows that spiraled into the margins. But this isn't like training or analyzing a villain's quirk. This is, he gestured vaguely at the blue-haired boy. You. Oboro's grin faltered just a fraction, a brief flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. Izuku noticed the shift and rushed to amend his statement, his cheeks warming. I mean, this is different because there's a time component. If the physics of quirk energy hold true, if residual energy can only maintain cohesion for so long without an anchor, then. His pen slowed, the ink bleeding into the paper. Then you might not be permanent. Energy usually dissipates unless it's being fed. Silence settled between them, heavy and humming with the sound of the library's ventilation. Oboro drifted down until his feet hovered just inches above the floor, his posture looser but somehow heavier, as if the weight of the years was finally catching up to his spectral form. Yeah, he said eventually. That tracks. I felt thinner, sometimes. Like a radio station losing its signal. Izuku swallowed hard. You're not surprised? Nah. Oboro shrugged easily, though his eyes remained serious. I figured I wasn't meant to stick around forever. Kinda defeats the whole dying thing, you know? It's supposed to be a one-way trip. He tried for humor, but the edges of his voice trailed off, thin and papery, like old parchment. Izuku's chest tightened, a familiar ache of sympathy blooming behind his ribs. He thought of his own quirk the way it held the echoes of those who came before. But if energy doesn't die, it changes, Oboro finished softly. That's the part you keep circling, isn't it? Izuku froze. The thought landed with a sickening, oily weight, the sound of a puzzle piece snapping into a slot that shouldn't exist in a hero's world. Oboro tapped his own chest. The motion didn't produce a thud. It rippled through him like a stone dropped in a still pond, his outline blurring into a haze of gray fog before snapping back into focus. I'm not me the way I was, Oboro said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum. But I think I have, I dunno, something like an anchor. Something is keeping the me part of this energy from changing into something else. Izuku looked up sharply, his pulse thrumming in his throat. An anchor? Like an object? A sentimental item? Think about it, Izuku, Oboro urged. He drifted closer and the temperature around the desk plummeted. His usual laid-back slouch had vanished, replaced by a rigid, unnerving stillness that reminded Izuku of a predator or a prisoner. 13 years. If I were really untethered, no body, no point of cohesion, I should have dissipated into background noise ages ago. I should be a memory, not a person. Izuku's fingers cramped around his pen. His brain, traitorously efficient at connecting the darkest dots, began lining up the clinical, cold probabilities. So, he swallowed hard against the sudden dryness in his mouth. So your body must still be around. In some form. Oboro's eyes widened, a flicker of something like vertigo crossing his face, a ghost realizing he might still be haunted by his own flesh. And if that's true, Izuku continued, his voice gaining a frantic, clinical momentum as he whispered to the air, then something or someone is preventing biological death. Artificial preservation, quirk-assisted stasis, something is keeping the engine idling so the driver can't truly leave the vehicle. The silence that followed was suffocating. Oboro let out a low, breathless whistle that sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. Wow. When you say it like that, it sounds really dark, man. Like a horror movie. Izuku nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Oboro's translucent shoulder, his mind flashing to the League of Villains, to the hero killer, all for one, one for all, Nabu Island, to the strange things he'd seen since entering UA. Yeah. It's the only thing that explains the stability of your quirk factor. But that means, Oboro gestured to his own misty limbs, a frown tugging at his mouth. I'm not stuck here because I'm sentimental or because I love UA too much to leave. I'm being held here. No, Izuku said, his voice barely a whisper, thick with a sudden, protective anger he didn't quite understand yet. You're stuck because you were never allowed to. The end. Oboro's brow furrowed, his expression clouding over literally. Small wisps of dark vapor curled off his forehead as he processed the horror of the realization. So, my body's still alive, but I'm locked out of the house. Izuku's stomach twisted. Or it's alive enough to keep your quirk factor from fully releasing. You're like a signal without a tower, Oboro. You didn't dissipate, but you can't move on because the connection hasn't been severed. Oboro's usual grin didn't come back this time. He looked down at his hands, watching them fade and flicker against the backdrop of the library shelves. That's unsettling. It gets worse, Izuku muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the library's ventilation. He flipped to a fresh page, his movements jerky and frantic. He sketched a rough, clinical diagram, a human silhouette, then a jagged bolt of energy representing a quirk factor trapped within. If someone knew this, if they understood that a preserved body could act as a containment vessel for residual energy, they could experiment, Oboro finished. His voice was hollow, stripped of its warmth. He looked at the drawing, the jagged bolt appearing less like a spark and more like a cage. Izuku nodded, his pen scratching harshly against the paper, the ink bleeding through in dark, jagged lines. They could test limits. See how much a body can be altered, reinforced, or even biologically reconstructed and still function as an anchor. See whether quirk factors can be redirected, or even combined. Oboro stared at the floor, his translucent hands clenching into white-knuckled fists that didn't quite have substance, yet seemed to vibrate with a sudden, localized intensity. Okay, but he shook his head, a desperate, reflexive spark of his old humor trying to ignite. My quirk just makes clouds, Midoriya. Fluffy ones. Good for naps. Sure, it'd be good for rescue missions and stuff, but why keep me on life support for 13 years just for that? I'm not exactly a heavy hitter like All Might. Izuku hesitated, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his teeth. He took a breath that felt like inhaling ice. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that made his skin crawl. He thought of the Nomu, the multiple quirks, the vacant eyes, the bodies that seemed sewn together from nightmares. There's another possibility. Oboro looked up. Every trace of the easygoing boy from the photographs was gone. He looked old. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had just realized the floor beneath him was a trapdoor. I don't like the tone of your voice, kid. Izuku exhaled, his hand trembling as he finally laid the pen down. It clattered against the wood of the table. What if it wasn't about your quirk specifically? What if the goal wasn't just what you could do, but how you were built? Go on. What if they didn't need Shirakumo Oboro? Izuku said, choosing each word with surgical, painful precision. What if they just needed a base? The air in the room didn't just turn cold. It turned stagnant, heavy with the weight of a horrific realization. Oboro flinched as if he'd been struck, his face contorting into a mask of dawning horror. He drifted back a few inches, instinctively trying to put distance between himself and the logic Izuku was weaving. I officially hate that. I hate every syllable of that. If a body can be modified, reinforced genetically and physically, Izuku continued, his gaze fixed on his notebook so he didn't have to see the look on Oboro's face, then the original quirk might just be the scrap metal left over from the foundation. The body is the framework. Something to build a new, multifaceted machine on. A vessel for whatever they wanted to pour in. Oboro laughed, a short, jagged sound that had no joy in it. It sounded like glass breaking. So you're saying someone looked at me, a 17-year-old kid who just wanted to be a hero and went, excellent raw materials. Izuku finally looked up. His green eyes were hard, shimmering with a mix of profound grief and a cold, focused fury. No, he said softly, his voice echoing with the weight of a promise. I'm saying someone looked at you and decided you weren't done being useful. Oboro's expression shifted, the confusion and the reflexive humor vanished, replaced by a deep, vibrating stillness. He crossed his arms, his form shimmering violently for a second, like digital static on an old screen. He looked at Izuku, his gaze searching, measured, and for the first time, truly seeing the steel beneath the boy's nervous exterior. So what you're saying is, Oboro said, his voice finally steadying into something grim and resonant, there's a reason I'm still here. This isn't just a haunting. It's like a distress signal. Izuku met his gaze, his resolve hardening into something sharp, unbreakable, and dangerous. He reached out and closed his notebook with a decisive, echoing snap that seemed to ring through the entire silent library. "What I'm saying," Izuku promised, his voice low and unwavering, "is that we're going to solve your own murder." Aizawa Shoyuta leaned back in his chair, the old wood clicking against his spine. His eyes, perpetually bloodshot and weary, narrowed as he tracked a very specific disturbance in the classroom's atmosphere. He had spent years honing his senses to detect the slightest shift in a room, the telltale hitch in a student's breathing, the indication of a quirk activating, the subtle ripple of anxiety. Over the past 2 days, hell, ever since that joint exercise, Midoriya Izuku had become a walking anomaly. The boy had always been a frantic bundle of nerves and muttering, but today the frequency was heightened. It was no longer just the background noise of a teenager with too much power and not nearly enough confidence. The kid was twitching. Every few seconds, Midoriya's head would ever so slightly snap to the right. His eyes would lock onto empty air with a pinpoint intensity that suggested he wasn't looking at a daydream, but at a living, breathing person. Shoyuta didn't see anyone. He activated his erasure for a split second, just to be sure there wasn't a stealth quirk at play, but the air remained empty. Yet, the muscle tension in Midoriya's neck was unmistakable. He was listening. He was reacting. "Something funny, Midoriya?" Shuta's voice cut through the air like a scalpel. He didn't raise his volume, but the dry edge of irritation was enough to bring the rest of Class 1A to a dead halt. Midoriya nearly vaulted out of his skin. His chair screeched against the linoleum, a sound like a dying bird, and his ears turned a shade of crimson that looked physically painful. Sorry. Nothing. Thought. A very loud thought. Midoriya's hands performed a frantic, fluttering dance over his notebook, the pages fluttering like a wounded moth before he slammed them flat against the paper. He ducked his head, his lips beginning to move in a silent, rapid-fire rhythm. Shuta's gaze sharpened. This wasn't the usual analysis, mumbling that acted as the boy's white noise. The cadence was wrong. It was responsive. It was a back and forth, a desperate attempt to shush someone who wasn't there. Shoyuta had seen distracted students before, tired, trauma-stricken, or struggling with the immense weight of their own minds. But Midoriya's focus was split between two distinct planes of existence. It was as if an invisible thread was tied to the boy's chin, jerking his attention away from the chalkboard every time Shuta's back was turned. Suddenly, Midoriya let out a soft, involuntary snort of laughter. It was a genuine, bright sound, utterly out of place in a dry lecture on hero ethics. The boy immediately recoiled, his entire body stiffening as if he just accidentally pulled the pin on a grenade. He pressed himself down into his desk, shoulders hunching up to his ears in a vain attempt to vanish into the wood grain. The sheer, radiating guilt coming off him was loud enough to drown out the lesson. The rest of the class barely blinked. They were used to Midoriya's eccentricities, but Shuta's brow furrowed. He watched through his curtain of dark hair as Midoriya buried his face in the crook of his elbow, his jaw working as he whispered into his own sleeve. "Not now. Please, stop. He's going to see." Midoriya's pen hovered, then began to move with a frenetic, desperate energy. He scratched lines so hard they likely embossed the 3 pages underneath. He was erasing and rewriting with a feverish intensity, his eyes darting to the empty air beside him as if asking for a spell check from a ghost. The bell rang, a sharp, metallic peal that sliced through the suffocating tension. While the other students moved with the practiced, lumbering ease of teenagers heading for lunch, Midoriya bolted. He shot upright, his eyes darting nervously from side to side like a cornered animal. He was offering frantic, whispered apologies to the air as he shoved his books into his yellow backpack. Shoyuta didn't move. He stood behind his lectern, his hands buried in his pockets, watching the boy hurry down the aisle. Midoriya was moving with a purposeful, jagged speed, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was leaning into a conversation, his shoulder dipping as if someone had just slung a heavy arm across it. Shuta's instincts prickled, the same instinct that told him when a villain was hiding in the rafters or when a trap was about to spring, but oddly enough, he felt more uneasy than fearful. So he didn't give chase. He didn't have enough evidence yet, and he knew that pushing the boy now would only make him retreat further into his own head. But he mentally filed the anomalies: the flushed skin, the reactive laughter, and the way Midoriya's eyes tracked a specific height and movement that didn't exist in the room. It was like a phantom, and it was carving Midoriya's composure into ribbons. He looked at the empty seat in the front row. Shoyuta turned back to the blackboard to erase his notes, but his hand paused mid-motion. The chalk dust smeared against the slate, a ghostly white blur that mirrored the fog settling in his mind. The unease didn't fade. It sat in the pit of his stomach, cold and heavy. It felt less like a student's breakdown and more like a memory one that hadn't been touched in 13 years. The way Midoriya's head had tilted, the specific angle of his grin when he'd snorted in laughter, the frantic energy of his hands, it was a silhouette Shoyuta knew by heart but had buried under layers of grief and exhaustion. For a split second, looking at the empty space beside Midoriya's desk, Shoyuta hadn't seen a troubled student. He'd seen a ghost of another life, a flickering phantom of blue hair and loud laughter that used to fill the silence of his own youth. It wasn't just that Midoriya was acting strange, it was that he was acting like him. Now that he began to think of it during the joint exercise, seeing Shinso and Midoriya together, chatting, battling, it was as if the dead boy was living through and between them. Shinsu's tufted-up hair, the way he rubbed his neck, his face when he pouted, Midoriya's wide smile, excitable speech, and his reckless abandonment. Shoyuta pulled his hand away from the board, his fingers stained white. He looked at the doorway where Midoriya had vanished. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if the past were trying to breathe through the present. It wasn't a warning of a breakdown anymore. It was the feeling of a grave being unsettled, and for the first time in a long time, Aizawa Shoyuta felt a cold, prickling fear that the dead weren't staying where he'd left them. Seriously, you'd think floating around a room would make me dizzy sometimes, Oboro said, spinning lazily in the air. His form was a slow-motion blur, shedding tiny, flickering wisps of gray vapor as he turned, like a cloud slowly unraveling at the edges. But nope. Feels like flying. You know, I think I would have become a pilot if the whole hero thing didn't pan out. Cloud9 Airlines has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? You're not flying, Izuku muttered. His voice was muffled, his chin tucked deep into the collar of his thickest all-might-themed blanket. He tugged the fleece higher around his shoulders, but it did little to combat the atmospheric shift. The chill Oboro radiated wasn't like an open window or a drafty floorboard. It was a deep, molecular cold that seemed to seep directly into his marrow, bypassing the fabric entirely. You're hovering. There's a distinct aerodynamic difference involving lift, drag, and propulsion that you are currently ignoring. Semantics, Oboro countered with a cheeky, lopsided grin. He tilted his translucent body until he was looking at Izuku sideways, his gravity-defying blue hair sticking straight out toward the desk like a compass needle pointing north. My feet don't touch the floor. Flying 2 inches is basically the same thing as flying 200 feet. It's a mindset, dude. You're too grounded. Literally. Izuku groaned, pressing his face into his palms until he saw flashes of white light behind his eyelids. The sheer absurdity of the night was finally starting to erode his sanity. I can't believe I'm arguing physics with a ghost. My quirk is literally built on the laws of kinetic energy and force accumulation, and I'm using it to debate a specter about altitude. Oboro drifted closer, sinking through the air with a fluid grace that lacked any of the resistance of oxygen. He settled just inches above the mattress. The blankets beneath him didn't even indent, not a single wrinkle formed in the fabric, but the air in the immediate vicinity turned sharp and wintry. Izuku's breath began to bloom in front of his face in small, rhythmic puffs of white. Hey, if you're gonna be the #1 hero, you gotta learn to negotiate with all kinds of unique situations, Oboro said, reaching out as if to pat Izuku's shoulder, his hand passing through the air like a shimmering mirage. Call this interdimensional diplomacy. It'll look great on a resume. Expert at de-escalating hauntings. That's a niche market right there. I am a hero, Izuku muttered into his hands, his breath hitching as the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. A shiver raced down his spine, unrelated to the cold. And I seriously doubt the curriculum at UA covers talking to the dearly departed as a core competency. Aizawa-sensei certainly didn't mention ghost whispering in the syllabus. Though with him, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by anything anymore. Sure, Oboro said, waving a hand dismissively. The motion left a faint, shimmering trail of mist in the air, a ghostly afterimage that lingered for several seconds before evaporating into the dim light of the dorm room. But you're the one who started this, Midoriya. You did say you wanted to figure me out. To understand the mechanics of my presence. Or was that just the sleep deprivation and the adrenaline talking? He paused, his expression softening into something uncharacteristically solemn, his eyes reflecting the glow of Izuku's computer monitor. Because if you want to look under the hood, you've got to be prepared for the fact that I don't exactly follow the manual anymore. Izuku blinked, letting out a long, shaky sigh that emerged as a pale, swirling puff of condensation in the freezing air. He sat up straighter, the mattress springs creaking under his shift in weight, and reached for his notebook. The familiar, slightly battered texture of the cover and the solid weight of it in his hands grounded him. It pulled him out of the surrealism of the haunted midnight and into his analytical comfort zone, a place where mysteries were just problems waiting for a methodology. Let's focus. This is hero research. Scientific inquiry, Izuku said, more to himself than to the ghost. Step 1. We establish the baseline of your memory. We need to know what's intact and what's been eroded by time. Oboro raised a thick blue eyebrow, his grin turning playful and slightly predatory. He did a slow somersault in the air, his limbs moving like he was submerged in water. Step 1, huh? Sounds official. Does this mean no cheeky interruptions allowed? No ruses? No ghost-related shenanigans? Izuku shook his head, his expression hardening into that intense, frighteningly analytical mask, the muttering mode, stare that usually made his classmates take a wary step back. Definitely no shenanigans. This is the real deal, Oboro. If I'm going to understand why you're here, why I'm the only one who can see or hear you, we need a method. We need rules. We need evidence that isn't just anecdotal or based on my own lack of sleep. Rules, observations, evidence, got it, Oboro said. He snapped his heels together in mid-air and gave a sharp, military-style salute before drifting in a slow, gravity-defying circle around the room's ceiling light. So, where do we start, Detective Midoriya? Do I get a magnifying glass and a trench coat, or are we sticking to the school supplies? Izuku bit his lip, his fingers feeling like stiff blocks of ice as his pen hovered over the pristine white page. He took a slow breath, trying to steady the tremor in his hand. We need to pinpoint the cutoff. Your last coherent, sensory memories before you became anything about your body, the environment, the specific smells or sounds. Even the smallest detail could be the anchor we're looking for. The brain usually records trauma with high fidelity, even if the conscious mind suppresses the actual event. Oboro's expression shifted instantly. The playfulness didn't vanish entirely, but it thinned out, becoming something more brittle and transparent. He tilted his head, staring at a dark corner of the ceiling where the shadows pooled like ink. That sounds complicated. My memory isn't exactly a straight line, Izuku. It's more like a shattered mirror. I've got fragments, feelings, flashes of light, and the sound of something heavy. But the edges are all jagged. It hurts to look at them for too long. They start to sting. That's fine, Izuku encouraged, his pen scratching a bold, underlined header onto the page. Chronological reconstruction. Subject Shirakumo. Even the shards can help. We can organize them, find the common threads, and build a map. Think of it like a cold case. We're just looking for the last thing you saw before the lights went out. Oboro hovered closer, his curiosity finally outweighing the instinctive hesitation that had clouded his eyes. He watched the way Izuku's hand moved with practiced, frantic speed, seemingly fascinated by the physical reality of the ink staining the paper, a permanence he no longer possessed. And you really think you can piece together whatever the hell happened to me? 13 years is a long time to be a cold case, kid. Izuku tapped his pen against the notebook. Tap, 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 the rhythmic, hollow sound echoing in the oppressive quiet of the dorm room. I have to try. It's what a hero does. They find the truth and they help the people, don't they? And besides, he hesitated, his voice dropping until it was barely a whisper, the cold of the room finally making his teeth chatter. I want to help you. I don't know what fixing this looks like, or if it's even possible, but we can't do anything if we're just standing in the dark. Izuku exhaled, his lungs feeling tight in the wintry atmosphere, and flipped to the first clean line. Okay, first question. What's the very last thing you remember before everything went dark? Oboro went still. Truly still, for the first time since he'd appeared. The flickering wisps of vapor trailing from his limbs seemed to freeze in place. He floated a little higher, his translucent fingers tapping together in a rhythmic, thoughtful cadence that mirrored Izuku's pen. I remember light, he started slowly. His voice sounded different, thicker, distorted, as if the memory itself had a physical weight he had to push through. Lots of light. Blinding. And noise, like a dull roar in my ears. Like being underwater during a thunderstorm. Then, confusion. Faces. Ugly ones, Izuku. People I didn't know, but they were looking at me like I was a project. They're all blurred, like looking through a foggy window in the rain. And cold. Definitely cold. A different kind of cold than I am now. Izuku scribbled furiously, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. Noise. Unidentified personnel. Low-temperature cryogenics? That's a start, Izuku whispered, his eyes wide and bright with a mixture of fear and academic fervor. That's a big start. It suggests you weren't alone. Oboro grinned faintly, a flickering, ghostly light dancing in his eyes. Whoa, you really are treating this like detective work. Makes me feel official. Like I'm part of an investigation, well, the one being investigated. But not in a like, holy shit, he's a murderer, kind of way. Of course. Izuku gave a small, nervous laugh as he once again tapped his pen against the open notebook, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of plastic against paper filling the quiet room. It was a grounding, living sound. A sound that was a sharp contrast to the silent, drifting presence across from him. Okay, so you remember the light, the noise, the faces. What about people you knew before that? Do you remember them clearly? Friends, classmates? Family? Oboro's grin softened, losing its sharp, mischievous edge. He drifted closer, hovering just inches above the all-might bedspread, his form casting no shadow despite the desk lamp. The air in the room didn't just get colder. It thickened, as if Kaminari had rubbed his feet against the carpet and charged with a sudden, crushing melancholic energy. How could I forget? Yeah, I remember them, I hang out with them too, even now. Shoyuda. Hisashi. We were close. Really close. We were going to start an agency together. The tiresome three troublemakers of Class A, or something equally cheesy. Izuku's breath hitched, and he nearly dropped his pen. He didn't need to ask for surnames, the names hit him with the force of a physical blow to the chest. Shoyuda and Hisashi. Aizawa-sensei and present Mike. He'd seen the way they interacted, the side glances they gave one another, the way they always sat together in the cafeteria, the way Mike could pull a rare smirk out of the eraser head. But to hear them spoken of in the present tense, with such casual affection, by a boy who hadn't aged a day since he knew them, it was jarring. It made the tragedy feel fresh, like an open wound. Oh, good, Izuku murmured, his hand shaking noticeably as he scribbled the names into the margin. Aizawa Shoyuda. Yamada Hisashi. You remember them vividly? The past them, not them now. And not just fragments or names, but their faces? Their personalities? The blue-haired spirit nodded slowly, his movements fluid and ethereal, like ink swirling in water. I remember Shuda's eye drops, he began, a wistful smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He'd go through a whole bottle in a week, head tilted back, blinking like an owl. And Hisashi? Man, you could hear that guy's laugh from 3 floors away even without his quirk. I remember the weight of their shoulders against mine. It's only the stuff after them that gets cloudy. Oboro drifted through the center of the room, his translucent fingers idly tracing shapes in the air. He left behind glowing, ghostly trails of vapor that shimmered before fading into the dim lamplight. Yeah. I can see our lunches, the way Shoyuta used to scowl at his juice boxes when he reached the bottom. Our stupid fights, the laughs, all of it. Thinking about it makes me feel a little alive, I guess. Even now. Izuku's grip tightened around his pen until his knuckles turned a stark, porcelain white. The weight of the situation, the sheer impossibility of the boy floating before him pressed down on his chest. That's really helpful, Oboro. If your memory of them is that strong, then your core consciousness might still be intact. It's not just data, it's you. He leaned forward, eyes wide with a mix of academic fervor and raw empathy. We just need to trace your last steps, who you were with, what you were doing right before the cutoff. Oboro hummed, tilting his head. He looked less like a tragic ghost and more like a student contemplating a particularly thorny math problem. Now that sounds a bit like homework. Or hero work, I should say. Izuku smiled faintly, finally letting some of the tension drain from his shoulders as he leaned back against the headboard of his bed. Exactly. This is just a special kind of case study. Only this time, the subject is you. Oboro chuckled, performing a lazy, slow-motion somersault above the bed, his cloud-like hair billowing upward. Color me bashful. But where do we even start? It's been 13 years, kid. The trail isn't just cold, it's frozen solid under a decade of snow. Izuku tapped the notebook decisively, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Well, first we could catalog everything you remember. Everyone, every mission, every location. Then we could check the public records. Old mission logs, news archives, UA school records, anything that might line up with your flashes of light and noise. If we find the where and the when, we might find the how. Oboro raised a brow, a mischievous, boyish gleam returning to his eyes. So, you want me to be your living memory bank? Hope you appreciate the company, Ace. I don't exactly come with a Dewey Decimal System. I do appreciate it, Izuku said, his voice dropping to a quiet, sincere register. He flipped to a fresh page, the white paper gleaming under his desk lamp like a blank map waiting to be filled. And I'll be careful with what we uncover. Step by step. No rushing. Oboro's expression grew softer, his edges blurring as his playfulness faded into something more somber. Step by step. But Izuku, there's just one thing. Even in the flashes, there are things I don't think I could ever remember fully. It's like there's a giant brick wall in my head. Whenever I try to look deeper into what I know, everything just goes dark. Like someone pulled the plug. Izuku tilted his head, pen poised. So you think you blocked them out? Like a trauma response? Maybe, Oboro admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like wind through dry leaves. Or maybe it's just unfinished business, ghostwise stuff. Like I need to remember what happened, the things I didn't get to finish before, well, everything ended. Izuku's stomach did a slow, sickening roll. He thought of Aizawa-sensei's tired eyes and present mixed loud, masking cheer. He thought of the gap in their lives where this boy should have been. He forced a steady nod. Then that's what we start with. Your friends. Your last moments. We figure out what you can recall first, and we'll build the bridge from this side. Oboro's grin returned, faint but warm, a flicker of the hero he was meant to be. All right, let's get to work, detective. Izuku exhaled, his pen hovering over the first line of the new page. Step 1. Catalog friends and allies. People you remember clearly. Quirks, habits, details, anything. Oboro floated closer, a spark of genuine amusement in his eyes as he watched Izuku's posture straighten and his analytical gaze sharpen. He let out a low whistle. God, you really do take notes on everything, huh? Guess it's not just schoolwork that makes you a nerd. Not just schoolwork, Izuku replied, a small, determined smile playing on his lips as he made the first mark on the page. This is a rescue mission. The classroom buzzed with the rhythmic scratch of pens and the low hum of focused students, but for Midoriya Izuku, the air felt thick with a static only he could feel. At the front of the room, Present Mike was in his element. The voice hero's energy was a physical force. His voice rose and fell like a radio dial being twisted, his hands cutting through the air in sharp, jagged arcs. He was trying to make the archaic nuances of Shakespearean English feel like a sold-out rock concert at the Budokan, and for the most part he was succeeding. Izuku sat at his desk, his notebook a battlefield of ink. His hand moved in a frantic blur, interspersing English translations with clinical, hushed observations of the figure floating beside him. Oboro was currently leaning lazily against the empty air just inches from Izuku's elbow, his translucent legs kicked out and crossed at the ankles as if he were reclining on a beach that didn't exist. To everyone else, the space was vacant. To Izuku, it was occupied by a flickering, blue-tinted memory. And remember, listeners, to truly feel the emotion of a soliloquy, you must channel it, explode it, own it. Yeah. Mick's voice boomed, the sheer decibel level vibrating the pens on the desks and making the water in Uraraka's bottle ripple in perfect, concentric circles. Several students laughed, caught up in the infectious, high-voltage magnetism of their teacher, while most quickly dipped their heads back to their work, scribbling down the explode it note as if it were a literal instruction. Oboro tilted his head, a wisp of gray cloud drifting from his hair like cooling steam as he watched his old friend. A soft, melancholic light danced in his ghostly eyes. Exploded? I mean, metaphorically, I hope? Zashi always did have a flair for the dramatic, but that's a bit much even for him. He looks exactly the same, by the way. But louder. If that's even possible. It's like he reached max volume in high school and then found a hidden setting. Izuku's pen stuttered mid-sentence, leaving a jagged, dark blot of ink on the page that looked like a Rorschach test. He stared at the smudge, his heart hammering against his ribs. Definitely metaphorical, he whispered, the words barely a breath of air, his lips barely moving. Good, Oboro said, a faint, nostalgic grin tugging at his lips. He drifted a few inches higher, looking down at Mike with an expression that was half fondness and half disbelief. Wouldn't want to literally blow anyone up. Though with his quirk, it's a 50-50 shot. Well, I guess he can't technically combust people. He just blows out their eardrums and shatters their dignity. Does that count as a blow-up? Izuku let out a small, sharp snort, a sound that escaped before he could catch it. He immediately muffled it behind his hand, turning it into a fake cough that fooled absolutely no one. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks, a prickly sensation spreading to his ears as he sensed the sharp, intuitive gaze of the teacher scanning the front row. Present Mick's glasses glinted under the fluorescent lights, his grin momentarily faltering as his eyes lingered on Izuku's suspiciously red face. You're really going to need to learn when to tone down the jokes, Izuku hissed under his breath, his eyes fixed with terrifying intensity on the chalkboard, memorizing the chalk dust patterns to avoid looking up. You know that, right? This is a grade A hero school, not a comedy club. I'm going to get a detention before we even get to the rescue part of this mission. Oboro just laughed, a sound like a distant wind chime, and did a slow, effortless roll in the air. Relax, Aizu. He can't hear me. And besides, if you can't laugh at a guy wearing that much leather in a classroom, what can you laugh at? He began to float lazily upside down, his face appearing directly over Izuku's notebook, defying both gravity and the traditional boundaries of personal space. His blue hair hung toward the desk like frozen lightning, each strand shimmering with a faint, bioluminescent glow that seemed to pulse in time with the room's hum. Besides, I'm practically a model student, Izuku. Invisible, hovering, quiet. I'm the soul of subtlety. I'm the ghost of Christmas, you should be laughing. Izuku's pen moved with a frantic, jerky energy, his handwriting becoming a cramped, illegible scrawl in the margins. Not subtle. Stop. He's looking. He was careful not to let his eyes linger on the empty air where Oboro's face was, focusing with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity on a diagram of a metaphor, but his peripheral vision was filled with that upside-down, grinning visage that refused to be ignored. Oboro let out a dramatic, silent gasp, clutching his translucent chest as if he'd been struck by a physical blow. He performed a slow mid-air recoil that sent a ripple through his misty form. How dare you? After all the help I've given you? Remember the tea kettle, Izuku? That water would have been a scorched memory if it weren't for my timely intervention. I'm a hero of the kitchen at the very least. Izuku's shoulders shook with a suppressed chuckle, a tiny, hitching sound that he tried to disguise as a sneeze. Despite the crushing tectonic weight of their investigation into the cut-off, the dark, jagged theories they had whispered about in the dim corners of the library, there was something undeniably comforting about Oboro's presence. He was a tether to a lighter world, a relic of a UA that felt more like a home and less like a fortress. He was someone who didn't look at Izuku as a problem child or the successor to the symbol of peace, but just as a kid who happened to be a good listener. At the front of the room, Present Mike paused mid-gesture, his golden pompadour shimmering under the harsh lights. He pushed his angular glasses up the bridge of his nose, his sharp, practiced eyes scanning the sea of students with the precision of a predator masquerading as a showman. He lingered on Izuku for a second longer than usual, his brow furrowing as a flicker of something: recognition? Confusion? A distant, painful memory? Crossed his face before he scribbled a quick, sharp note on his clipboard. Make sure we keep our eyes up, listeners. Shakespeare is all about the vision. Don't want to miss the best part, you dig? Eyes on the prize, hearts in the sky. The class chorused a collective, well-practiced, yes, sir. But the energy in the room had shifted, at least for Izuku. Izuku hunched deeper over his notebook, his spine curving into a defensive shell. He felt the weight of Aizawa-sensei's cold suspicion from earlier that morning and now mixed puzzled curiosity. It was a pincer maneuver of faculty attention he wasn't prepared for. I wish I was invisible, he muttered, his voice thick with the suffocating stress of the double life he was leading. It had only been 24 hours since Oboro appeared, and his legendary composure was already fraying at the seams like an old costume. Oboro drifted closer, his form blurring at the edges until he was little more than a smudge of blue and gray hovering just above the desk's surface. The humor drained from his face, replaced by a somber, ancient loneliness. He turned his head slightly, looking at the empty floor space beside Izuku, the exact spot where a desk should have been 13 years ago, occupied by a boy who loved clouds and loud friends. Wouldn't recommend it, dude, Oboro said softly. His voice was barely a hum in the air, cold as a winter draft through a cracked window. Trust me. Being seen. Being there to be looked at? That's the best part. Shoyuta was nursing a cup of black coffee, bitter, lukewarm, and exactly the kind of acidic jolt he needed to survive the afternoon when Hisashi stepped into the faculty lounge. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the muffled chaos of the hallways. For a heartbeat, Hisashi just stood there, letting the rare, vacuum-like silence of the empty room settle over him like a blanket. Hey, Sho, he greeted. His voice, usually a force of nature that could shatter glass and fill stadiums, was pulled back into a quiet, uneasy murmur. The vibrant stage persona had slipped, revealing the tired man beneath the leather and hairspray. Shoyuta lifted his gaze over the rim of his mug, his dark, bloodshot eyes tracking the unusual tension in his husband's shoulders. Something wrong? Hisashi shrugged, but the movement was jagged, lacking its usual fluid confidence. He leaned against the counter, his fingers drumming a restless, syncopated beat against the laminate, a nervous habit he hadn't displayed since their own student days. I dunno. Have you noticed anything off about Midoriya lately? Off how? Shoyuta set his cup down. The ceramic hit the table with a dull thud, his interest piqued despite the leaden exhaustion dragging at his limbs. He knew Hisashi's instincts. The man was a performer, finely tuned to the energy and focus of an audience. If he felt a shift in the room, it was usually there. Hisashi ran a hand through his hair, knocking several strands of his signature style slightly out of place. I can't put my finger on it. He's just different. A little spacey, but in a frantic way. 1 second he's hyper-focused, pen blurring across the page like he's recording a manifesto, and the next he's completely lost. Like he's waiting for someone to finish a sentence that hasn't been spoken yet. He paused, looking at the speckled linoleum floor. Does his file mention anything about a dissociative disorder? Or maybe a sensory processing issue related to his quirk's evolution? Shoyuta arched a brow, his mind immediately pulling up the mental footage of Midoriya in homeroom the way the boy's head had snapped to the side as if someone had whispered a secret in his ear. I've noticed him becoming more reactive. He's fidgety even for him. He glances into the corners of the room or at the empty air beside his desk as if he's tracking a fly no one else can see. But the kid's always been high-strung. I'd assumed it was just the mounting pressure of the semester. They did just get back from Nabu, and the aftermath of that hasn't been easy on any of them. Hizashi tilted his head, his frown deepening until it was etched into his face. Maybe. But it's not just nerves, Shoyuta. It's like he's reacting to a physical presence. It's too specific. The eye contact, the timing of his reactions. It's like he's sharing a desk with someone. Shuda's hands stilled on his mug. The thought hung in the air between them, heavy and unwelcome. He took a slow, measured sip of the bitter coffee, his expression a mask of professional neutrality, though a cold, sharp knot was beginning to tighten in his gut. Aizawa didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in quirks, and Midoriya's quirk was a black box of unknown variables. Reacting to something no one else can see, huh? Hizashi leaned closer, his voice dropping into a register he only used when the microphones were off and the world was truly serious. I know it sounds crazy, and believe me, I've heard plenty of crazy in this job, but he's holding conversations. Not out loud, mostly. Just tiny mouth movements. Micro gestures. And then he'll snort or laugh at a joke no one told. Shoyuta, I swear he's looking at someone. He's looking at a space that should be empty, but he's treating it like it's occupied by a friend. Shuda's jaw tightened, his teeth clicking together. He reached up, rubbing the bridge of his nose where a dull headache was beginning to pulse behind his eyes. The description was too specific, too consistent with his own private observations to be dismissed as teenage eccentricity behavior. If Midoriya was seeing things, the implications were staggering. It was either a mental health crisis, a hallucination-based quirk from an external enemy targeting the class, or most worryingly an evolution of the boy's own power. I'll keep a closer watch on him, Shoyuta said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly eraserhead tone that usually signaled the start of an interrogation or a high-stakes mission. You do the same. But Hizashi, keep it subtle. If he's experiencing some kind of sensory hallucination, a quirk-related side effect, or even a mental health crisis, I don't want to spook him into hiding it. If he feels cornered, he'll stop reacting and will lose the ability to gauge the extent of what he's perceiving. Hizashi nodded, a visible wave of relief washing over his face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He slumped slightly against the counter, the rigid tension in his spine finally giving way. Thanks, Sho. I don't like the look in his eyes. It's not just a typical student's distraction. It's almost fondness? Like he's sharing a private joke with an old friend. It's haunting me. I just want to make sure the listener's all right. Shoyuta leaned back, his chair creaking under the weight. He swirled the dark, dreg-filled liquid in his mug, watching the coffee coat the ceramic sides in a bitter film. Make sure the listener's all right. He knew that feeling well. It was the constant, low-thrumming anxiety of a teacher who had already seen too many promising lives cut short. He thought of Midoriya's self-sacrificial streaks, the broken bones, and the way the boy acted as if he carried the entire world on his shoulders. The last thing the kid needed was to lose his grip on reality. The lounge returned to its quiet hum, the rhythmic buzz of the industrial refrigerator the only sound filling the gap between them. The two teachers sat in a shared, heavy silence, a comfortable quiet born of years of partnership, yet underscored by a new, nameless dread. They sat mere walls away from the 1A classroom, neither of them realizing that the nothing Midoriya was looking at was the very person they had both spent 13 years trying to mourn. The phantom of their youth was sitting in their classroom, and the only person who could see him was the one student who couldn't stop getting into trouble. This is Aizawa-sensei? Izuku gasped, a startled, breathless laugh escaping his lips as he leaned closer to the yearbook pages on the library's old table. The blue light of Izuku's open laptop reflected in his wide eyes. Oboro grinned, floating a little lower until his translucent chin was nearly resting on Izuku's shoulder, his form casting no shadow but bringing a distinct, cool draft to the air. Sure is. Same messy black hair, same soulful eyes, though, no massive bags under them back then. He actually slept occasionally. And that smile? Oh man, that smile was all awkward charm and pure, unadulterated pain. Izuku squinted at the scanned photo from 13 years ago. He tried to reconcile the image with his current homeroom teacher, the man who lived in a yellow sleeping bag, valued cold logic above all else, and seemed physically incapable of a genuine grin. In the photo, a teenage Shoyuta Aizawa was looking slightly away from the camera, his chin tucked into his collar. His lips were quirked in a stiff, uncomfortable line that could almost be mistaken for a smirk if you looked at it in the right light, though it clearly looked like it had been forced out of him by a heavy-duty quirk. "He looks like a kid," Izuku muttered, unable to stop a fresh wave of chuckles. It was a silly, obvious observation, but seeing the legendary, terrifying Eraserhead with rounder cheeks and a UA uniform that actually looked crisp and ironed was a total shock to his system. It's like looking at a different person, but the eyes are identical. Oboro chuckled along, shaking his head until his blue hair flapped around his face like silk. "Geez, I forgot about that face he made. Hizashi and I spent the whole morning telling him he had a charming smile, and that he should use it to catch the eye of the person he wanted to impress. We told him it was his secret weapon. We didn't think he'd actually try to deploy it for the school photographer. He was so sad afterward, didn't talk to us for 2 days straight. Just glared and communicated through aggressive sighing and very pointed blinking." Izuku laughed quietly, covering his mouth to keep the sound from traveling through the room and alerting anyone else in the hallway. 2 days? That sounds... Who am I kidding? Exactly like him. Yeah, that's Shoyuta for you. Well, you know that better than anyone by now, Oboro said with a faint shrug, the corners of his mouth twitching with a bittersweet fondness. Even back then, when he wanted to seem aloof and too cool for school, he didn't do anything half-hearted. If he was going to be grumpy, he was going to be the best at being grumpy. But man, the way he froze when he realized we were standing at the back of the gym watching him take that photo, priceless. I think Hizashi actually fell over and hit his head on a rack of volleyballs because he was laughing so hard. Izuku's mind raced, thinking of all the times Aizawa had silently judged him in class, the way he could read a student's potential or their deepest insecurities without saying a single word. He looked back at the screen, seeing the boy who would become his mentor. So, he's always been like that? Even then? Stern and serious? I always wondered if he was just born as a tired adult. He was definitely born with a midlife crisis already in progress, Oboro joked, his voice softening. But yeah, he was always the one watching the world while we were busy making a lot of noise. He saw the things we missed. Kind of like you. Oboro sighed, tilting his head. Some things never change. That's why you can trust him, even when he's being a total hardbutt. He sees everything. His grin softened, turning a little wistful as he stared at the digital image of his friend. Honestly, it's nice to see him like that. A little dense despite that big brain of his. Easy to tease. I mean, he's definitely not young anymore. He looks like he's aged 20 years in the last 13. Izuku scribbled a note in the margins of his ghost investigation page. Aizawa-sensei, consistent personality traits since adolescence, trustworthy, highly perceptive, low tolerance for nonsense, easily annoyed by peers. He looked up at Oboro, his curiosity getting the better of him. And you and present, Hizashi? Just as close. Oboro's expression softened, his eyes drifting toward the window where the moon was beginning to rise. Yeah, back then we were inseparable. We were the ones usually dragging Shoyuta along. Well, I'd do most of the dragging, and Hizashi would grab Shuta's hand to make sure he came too. Izuku nodded thoughtfully, his pen slowing as he looked at the ghost of the boy who should have been a pro hero alongside the teachers he admired. I wonder if Oboro would have become a teacher too. The tragedy of it hit him again, both a sharp and dull ache. All the stolen potential, memories, moments, the empty space in those old photos where a third hero should have been standing. So again, you're sure you remember all of that clearly? Super sure? 100% sure. Izuku asked. Oboro's grin returned, sharper this time, carrying a spark of the mischief that must have defined him. 1,000,000% sure. Every bit. Just know that at least the grown-up versions of them really haven't changed all that much in the ways that matter. Izuku paused. Well, they grieve you? That must have changed them. Oboro stared at Izuku, as if Izuku said something that made him want to object a previous statement of his. The ghost's demeanor shifted and he started curling into himself. I mean, why I guess. Their 20s were rough years for them. Hisashi, he was super angry, like all the time. He still gets angry now too, but he's good at handling it, at least when in classes and at home. He always tells Shoyuta he doesn't want his kids to see him upset. And Shoyuta, well, he just got more tired, I guess? Like, he sleeps so much more now than he used to. Izuku nodded, deciding not to push Oboro anymore. He tried for a grin. Say, does Aizawa-sensei have sleeping bags in different colors? Or is he a strictly yellow kind of guy? Oboro's incandescent grin returned as kicked his legs out and drifted backward lazily. You know it. His favorite is his purple one. It's got these little kitten pattern too. Then another pause. But it's nice, seeing them every day, knowing despite everything, feels like the good old times, even if I'm just a fly on the wall. Izuku tried not to be surprised at the sudden switch up, so instead, he didn't just scribble a note. He slashed a heavy line under a heading in his notebook, the friction of the pen against the paper mirroring the spark of adrenaline in his chest. The horror of their base model theory from earlier hadn't vanished, but it had been transmuted into a cold, driving need for concrete answers. Well, we're gonna need more than old yearbooks to figure out what happened to you, Izuku muttered, his eyes darting across his own handwriting as he mapped out the school's layout in his mind. He looked up, his expression shifting into that intense, slightly unnerving stare he got whenever a complex strategy began to take shape. The public library doesn't keep detailed incident reports, especially not ones flagged for something this sensitive or involve student fatalities. Izuku calculated, his thumb clicking the top of his pen rhythmically. Click-clack, click-clack. So the actual files, the medical reports, and the scene forensics could be in one of three places. He began ticking them off on his fingers, his voice dropping into a low, focused mumble. The restricted faculty archives, the high-security basement storage, or, he trailed off, a small chill that had nothing to do with Oboro's presence running down his spine. Principal Nedzu's private office. Oboro's eyebrows shot up, his translucent form flickering with a sudden, nervous energy. He did a slow somersault in the air, coming to a halt upside down to look Izuku in the eye. The principal, huh? High stakes right out of the gate. I like the confidence, kid. Izuku's eyes glazed over as he entered a full-blown mutter, his pen moving in a rhythmic, frantic blur that left a trail of ink across the margin of his notebook. We can't break into Ned's office. That's a suicide mission for a student. The security sensors, the weight-sensitive flooring, the thermal scanners. I'd be caught before I even reached the hallway. But, he looked up, his gaze fixing on Oboro with a sudden, sharp intensity. You could float in there. You can move through walls, bypass the biometric locks, and sift through the physical files without ever getting caught. Oboro's bravado faltered. For a second, he let out a long, weary groan, his entire body sagging in midair like a deflating balloon. Ugh, I'm getting tired just hearing about it. Doing actual spy work? I was more of a charge and yelling kind of guy, kid. Loud and proud. He flipped upright, his expression turning wary as he looked toward the dorm room door. I'd have to do it at night, or else Ned's as smart as he is will just see a floating folder or a drawer sliding open on its own. You think he has cameras in there? I mean, he's the principal, he probably values his privacy, right? Izuku's thumb began clicking his pen click-click-click, a nervous habit that mirrored the rapid-fire gears turning in his head. He's the smartest being on the planet, Oboro. He probably doesn't just have cameras. He'd have, like, a state-of-the-art surveillance web. He definitely has them in the office, in the vents, probably in the light fixtures. If a shadow moves half an inch out of place, he'll know. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied the way Oboro's form occasionally shivered with a faint, iridescent static, especially when he got agitated. Wait, Izuku said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming low and conspiratorial. Even if he does have the best tech in the world, maybe you could short-circuit them? Oboro tilted his head, a wisp of gray cloud escaping his ear and dissipating into the ceiling. Short-circuit them? I'm a ghost, Izuku, not an EMP. I can barely nudge a pencil without feeling like I've run a marathon. No, but your energy, Izuku countered, leaning forward so far he nearly tipped his chair, his notebook sliding to the very edge of the desk. His excitement was starting to override his paralyzing fear of the faculty. We talked about the anchor. If you're a concentrated mass of residual quark energy, you might have a passive electromagnetic field. When you passed through me, I felt static. If you forced yourself to, flare up, if you pushed your energy outward all at once, you could create enough electronic interference to white out a sensor or loop a digital recording just long enough to move. Oboro looked at his hands, flexing them. For a moment, a jagged spark of blue-white light danced between his knuckles, smelling faintly of ozone, petrichor, and a coming storm. The air in the room hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. A flare, huh? He looked back at Izuku, a slow, dangerous smirk spreading across his face, the kind of look that probably used to give the UA teachers of the past a massive headache. So I'm not just a spy. I'm a saboteur. Izuku nodded, his face set in a look of grim determination that looked older than his years. The weight of the raw materials, theory sat heavy on his chest. If we're going to find out who turned you into a base model, who decided that your life was just a resource to be harvested, we have to start with the one person who keeps all the secrets.